Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and also thanks to the organizers for putting me late in the day. It's a rather advantageous position, and hopefully it gives me a chance to pick up on some of the very interesting discussions raised earlier today. So again, thank you. What I'm going to be discussing is several things. I want to quickly introduce the concept of the community campus, want to theorize the agenda within discourse and within practice, explore then the concept of the community campus, what it is, where it is, and why it's important, and then talk very briefly about some next steps that colleagues and I are doing as part of research looking into this concept, which runs in parallel with university's agenda of putting such a proposition in place. So in introducing this concept, several things I want to talk about. One is recognizing the very literal idea of placing the university within the wider community, where the campus becomes synonymous with the community and the community becomes synonymous with the campus. And its intention is to open up the campus to the wider community, but also to have the campus or academia play a greater role in the wider community's life. And this understanding that this idea of the community campus is a nexus for transdisciplinary work that is civically engaged, but it's also not only about students learning, it's about providing support to the community. And this concept, I would suggest, has increasing importance in context of changing economic and social conditions, the latter including issues arising out of COVID. And intrinsic to the concept is an emphasis on fostering a dialogic relationship, and picking up on the earlier speaker's commentary and reference to Bakhtin, and Bakhtin factors in very significantly here, as you're just about to hear. So suddenly my computer's not, there we go, okay. So recognizing Michael Holquist's argument that Bakhtin suggests we need to theorize our position within an overarching conceptual framework, and coincidentally the word position is in that sentence, but I think it's very apt here. And putting this into a bigger perspective, Bakhtin's suggestion that an aesthetic event, that is the idea of making wholes, requires at least two participants to be present. And that has some significance in my background as an architect, because architects are sometimes accused of acting singularly, of imposing visions. So this very idea runs contrary to some of the inherited conceptions of the architect as sole maker or sole designer. Within that context then of bringing two or more participants together, we recognize that in that meeting, there are two or more different worlds that are present. Even if they may be in the same position geographically, it doesn't mean that they're seeing the world the same. And as Holquist, echoing Bakhtin, suggests, a logical implication of that is that we can't see everything, but if we try and see together, we can overcome that lack of seeing. Significant here then is that we need to find an appropriate position where we can reduce this difference of horizons and find ways of trying to generate a dialogue. So as Holquist continues, the key thing here, certainly within the context of what I'm suggesting, is the idea of the point of view, where one is situated. And as Bakhtin puts forward, being situated on the boundary, as it were, of the world. And that boundary can take many forms. And I'm picking up on Bakhtin's commentary about the significance of threshold, understanding the boundary not as something that divides, but rather that it's a place of meeting, and that place of meeting is quite significant. And we can generate threshold encounters in which we can have interactions with others, whether ideas or other people, and that those interactions then are quite significant. So the threshold assumes quite a substantial importance. This agenda is also grounded in practice, both my own and others. I'm not suggesting I'm the only one that has experienced it, but I will give it an insight from my own perspective. Most of my work that I've been doing as a practicing architect, as an educator, has been in the context of somewhere else. I'm an expat American who's lived in the UK going on 32 years, but I've also worked and lived in India and worked in Africa, amongst other places. And at a certain point, it came to me that, well, I'm the other in this context. And so that created a notable shift in terms of how I approached projects. Also important here is situating one's practice in the community, which is a point I'm going to put forward with this idea of the community campus. Certainly in work that I did as an architect, and I know other architects have worked this way, there have been instances where they literally located themselves in the community. I, for a time, lived on a housing estate where we were carrying out a regeneration project. And in a very short time, I learned a lot more than I ever could have through countless meetings. So the idea of situating oneself becomes quite a profound challenge. It offers its own threshold encounter. It also helped in a way in terms of not making myself a member of a community. I certainly never would be in the UK with this accent, but at least it provided a certain degree of familiarity for people of seeing me around, and that enabled certain conversations then to take place. Also present within this practice is that it's co-joined with the community and other disciplines. Whenever we were doing housing estate regeneration projects in the UK or work in India or Africa, fundamental to our work would be to start talking to doctors, to local schools, to local police, local religious leaders, community leaders, and so forth. People that had some insights. At no point would we attempt to go it alone. So it was just intrinsic to how we operated that we would make those sort of connections. And this is important to think about in terms of this proposition of the university adopting some approach based on a community campus. Recognizing our inherited model is grounded in an academy and cathedral schools, monastic schools, somewhere shut away, not connected with the world. It was introverted. And the community campus, by its very nature, saying, no, let's open up, let's make those connections to the world. Certainly in my own practice as an educator, and a lot of other examples that exist in architecture and in other disciplines, is something that I would refer to as a mobile studio or mobile ideas factory or mobile classroom, however you might want to refer to it. In those instances, going out into the community, contributing, having a dialogue, finding ways to support the community in terms of enhancing their livelihoods. But also intrinsic to that sort of action is we were in effect parachuting in. We would go in for a day and at the end of the day, go home. Or we might go in for a short time, say on a study trip somewhere doing field work. But after a relatively short period, say 2 weeks, again, we would pack up and go home. Not quite tourists, but at the same time, not people that were making a continuing contribution to the community and living the community's life. Another challenge is recognizing the difference that exists, notably when one's doing education projects, interacting with the community. And my colleague, Paul Warwick, together with some other colleagues, identified this image of triangle of students, community, and staff, recognizing that each has its own expectations, own agendas, and each then has its own experiences of disappointment in coming to a project. So there's a challenge of trying to generate a common dialogue through which one can move forward. But sometimes that's difficult. Those things can remain hidden or they can come in conflict with each other. And so there's a big challenge about how we deal with that disparity. And it's echoed in this comment by James Donald, a writer on urbanism, who makes the provocation that the internal and possible question of how we strangers can live together. And certainly when we start talking about the urban and something recognized by architects or urbanists planners, is the idea that we can talk about the city as some sort of singular idea, but it's not the reality. Rather, the city is defined by multiplicity. It's about multiple agendas, multiple points of view coming together. And so the challenge then is, how do we start to deal with that? How do we start to negotiate that difference? Underlying the idea of the community campus then is the generation of this dialogic space, which can be in a very literal sense. It can also be in a figurative sense. And I'm talking about both in this instance. And the nature of that dialogic space is it recognizes that there is difference. We can't ignore it, and rather would suggest that we embrace that difference, not shy away from it. And part of that difference is working together to co-construct that space, and the need for me to embrace what others are bringing to the discussion in that act of making. Also present in this is recognition of the site as something that is multi-layered. The context that we work in, akin to Lefebvre's notion of the millefeuille pastry, multiple things layered up and multiple layers of activity, cultural, ecological, and so forth. And certainly with students and within community work that I've done, working within the gaps or overlaps, the gaps, places that one can start to fill in, or the overlaps, things where there might be something to build upon. There's a number of precedents I would point to, notably drawing from the arts, where although it's an arts facility, it seems to function almost as much as a community center, a place where the community can come together and partake in various types of events. And suggestion that a really simple change that universities could make is start to open up their campuses in the same way. So what I'm putting forward here is the concept of the community campus as a threshold. And Adrienne Rich has talked about the idea of the university without walls and the opportunities that it would afford in terms of supporting human life. And Tom Sperlinger and colleagues have talked about the need for universities to reorganize themselves, to work across disciplines, work with the whole of society if we're going to meet the challenges that we are increasingly finding. And echoing something that Dr. Plessing was suggesting this morning, there's a need to recognize informality and what that offers. And it's something that Just Boyce has written on, notably about the value of informal learning and informal learning spaces and the significant role they play in terms of enhancing people's understanding and ability to act. Present in this is also the reemergence of the local. And from an economic standpoint, there's an increasing shift away from the big is beautiful approach or the Spanish Omerta to something that Stuart Brand calls art commandos, something that's smaller, fleet of foot, much more agile, and able to operate in response to very fluctuating conditions, notably those economic. Concurrent with this is a shift of town centers away from commercial and retail, the demise of the high street in the UK, to places that will be more infused with culture, education, health, and leisure. So the way that we understand our town centers is going to shift. And this offers opportunity, I would suggest, for universities to become a part of that. Also, brought about by a number of factors, but certainly exacerbated or accelerated by COVID, has been the rediscovery of our neighborhood and our neighbors. So shifting away from a more centralized model to one that is more distributed. So I think each of these things contribute to the idea that we might start to rethink some of our models of universities. Again, recognizing that there are those that have been active in this way, but there's opportunity here to rethink how the university positions itself and what that repositioning affords in terms of how it can act. My colleague, Paul Warwick, and I founded and run something called Urban Dialogues at Plymouth, which is intended to bring together like-minded academics and those in the wider community who are active in civic engaged learning and explore best practice, but also to identify opportunities for synergies within our work. And as part of that, we've already carried out a mapping of current University of Plymouth work in terms of civic engagement, and have also carried out some degree of mapping of current UK practice, notably within the field of architecture. And what we're currently working on is looking at UK and wider global practice, and also looking at the work of our international partners in this field. So continuing with the next steps, and just 2 slides to go. One of the things we're finding is oftentimes the moves that are made by various initiatives tend to be a bit singular in focus, restricted amount of interdisciplinary activity. They either focus on very micro issues or focus on overarching macro issues. And sometimes they're not even orientated towards the community, though they can be situated within the community. And typically the community is not involved in either the planning or implementation of these centers. So within our current work, what we're finding is a mix of both service learning and something very directly supporting communities through direct action, but also scenario-based looking and using students to help generate discussion and exploration of possibilities which the community could take forward. Not a distinct solution, but rather alternatives that can be pursued further in terms of examination by the community. Also finding that central to this work is that it's grounded in sustainable education and understanding education as an agency of sustainability, which ties us into the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, in closing, just want to draw attention to the importance of play, and drawing heavily here on Miguel Sicart and his discussions about the act of creative engagingly with the world as a way of appropriating a context and of bringing freedom to that context, notably of freedom of action and thought. And through that play, we can express our being in the world, but it also, very importantly, allows us to form relationships with things and other people. So a number of key things that we're looking to build upon in terms of the how that one might act. And today really just wanted to highlight some of the aspects about what it is, where it is, and why it's important. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and many thanks.
Okay, so the title of the paper is Curating Spaces of Hope, Exploring the Potential for Faith-Based Organisations, or FBOs, and Intra-communities Dialogue in a Post-COVID Society. So during the paper, I'm going to consider how FBOs, or the role of FBOs in connecting and resourcing communities through dialogue with the public sector during the pandemic, and the potential for dialogues of these kinds to inform curation of new spaces of hope, engagement, and practice in a post-pandemic society. So first, I'm going to set out the role of FBOs during the pandemic using the Keeping the Faith report commissioned by the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Faith and Society and delivered by the Faith and Civil Societies Unit at Goldsmiths, University of London, with support from the William Temple Foundation, where I'm a research fellow. Secondly, I'm going to introduce Spaces of Hope, a new paradigm of FBO, including a consultative methodology and tools of dialogue produced through my PhD thesis at Goldsmiths. Third, I will contextualise the relevance of Spaces of Hope to post-pandemic dialogue between communities across the faith and public sectors using data from my thesis and the Spaces of Hope network, including data from the inquiry into the future of civil society in England. And then fourth and finally, I will consider how Spaces of Hope can facilitate intra-communities dialogue and its implications for FBOs and communities post-pandemic. So beginning with the Keeping the Faith report, it was commissioned by the APPG for Faith and Society and conducted by Goldsmiths and the William Temple Foundation. The report analysed how local authorities and FBOs worked together during the pandemic across the UK. There was a perception that FBOs were amongst first responders, mobilising well-established networks and procedures that in some cases had been honed during the past decade of austerity. A bespoke survey was sent to 408 local authorities and 55 in-depth interviews were conducted with local authority leaders and FBO members across 10 sample areas. 4 key themes emerged. The first, the pandemic has given rise to a significant increase in the numbers and depth of relations between local authorities and FBOs. Local authorities expressed a new appreciation for the agility, flexibility, and professionalism of FBOs. The second theme, local authorities regard FBO assets as integral and essential to the COVID response. Thirdly, local authorities report their experiences of working in partnership with faith groups as overwhelmingly positive. Fourth and finally, almost every local authority in the study endorses a commitment to build on and to deepen relationships, supporting long-term policy interventions and partnerships in ways that are different to the current practices and norms. During the parliamentary debate of this report in February 2021, Eddie Hughes, Conservative MP for Walsall North, stated, "During the pandemic, churches, mosques, gurdwaras and temples have opened their doors wide to provide essential support for their most vulnerable people in their communities, and not just those of faith. This year, we have seen with our own eyes how faith groups have an ability to mobilise resources that some other civil society actors simply do not. The APPG's report, Keeping the Faith, rightly picked that up. It's fair to say that this has surprised some people." So it was encouraging to hear how FBOs responded. However, we should read this in the context of an uncertain and changing time, and as Johnson 2014 highlights, a need for a new definition of FBOs in policy and practice. The fourth theme from Keeping the Faith is of particular interest. Is commitment to a different way of working going to be sustained? How are FBO assets understood without a clearly defined understanding of FBOs? Is the pandemic going to be a threshold moment for the role of FBOs in communities, social policy, and in public life more broadly? So in response to these questions, I'm going to summarise my PhD research, setting out a new paradigm of FBO, which I'm calling Spaces of Hope. So my PhD thesis offers a new paradigm of FBO, Spaces of Hope, defined in terms of liminality, difference and creative potential, rhizomatic or non-linear forms, and the co-production of shared values. The thesis utilises literatures of geographies of post-secularity, social policy, sociology of religion, and spatial public theology to locate spaces of hope in response to calls for a new definition from Johnson 2014. I utilised assemblage theory by Toulouse and Guattari, actor network theory by Latour, and mixed methodologies to map social material flows across 3 ethnographic sites in northwest urban locations, northwest UK. My research identifies 6 modalities of spaces of hope, which I refer to more broadly or in a summary term as the socio-material nuances of space. So these 6 modalities are: 1, types of relationships with place, service, and transformation. 2, leadership as incarnational and rooted in changing roles and responsibilities. 3, sources of motivation as emergent and contextual with discernible foundations and formation. 4, FBOs as the interface with public space, including dialogue, welcome and care and professionalism. 5, the prophetic and authentic nature of our stories. And 6, administrative and relational flows. So finding the flow, building alliances, movements, networks, and partnerships, and counting the cost of and embracing change. So the paradigm uses these 6 kind of modalities, which I'm summarizing as the socio-material nuances of space, to develop new understandings of power, assets, leadership, and alliances appropriate for social policy. Spaces of Hope has interdisciplinary implications for defining FBOs, the temporal tradition of public theology, mapping geographies of post-secularity, defining faith-based assets in social policy and practice, and discerning different beliefs, values, and worldviews in a diversifying belief landscape in the UK. The socio-material nuances of space are at the heart of this paradigm, each distinct and simultaneously interdependent. They set out the different and creative potential effects that make up the spaces that we inhabit and form the community assets that are expressed by FBOs and are relied upon by social policy and pandemic response. The rhizomatic structure of the paradigm means that any of the 6 modalities can emerge as a guiding influence on the others. So dialogue, as a facet of modality 4, the interface with the public space, informs and is informed by the other socio-material nuances and the assets that emerge from communities. So here I briefly set out spaces of hope, contextualized where the role of dialogue sits and how it relates to both the other social material nuances of space, and offered a sense of how it might implicate wider communities. I'll turn now to a case study from the inquiry into the future of civil society in England from 2018. So Spaces of Hope emerged out of 10 years of personal experience of a wide range of social issues, from social isolation and loneliness to domestic abuse, professional practice, including community work, a social movement, a commission network, and grounded research as part of my PhD. From October 2016 to 19, these activities included contributions from 900 plus people across 35 dialogue-based gatherings. The inquiry into the future of civil society within its bridge building and peace brokering strand summarises these gatherings as bringing together innovative mixes of civil society actors, from professional community practitioners through to individual community activists, to meaning make as a response to experiences of pointlessness and emptiness in personal, community and professional life. Continuing, the process is characterised as doing three things. One, to produce deeply authentic networks and relationships. Two, to surface meanings and values shaping the work. Three, to identify and act on concrete implications for community practice. A key activity within these gatherings was the Spaces of Hope Hubs network, a council commission network that ran through 2017 and 18, engaging 167 people across 70 organisations with 9 formal gatherings. The network utilised an approach based on appreciative inquiry to engage people in subjective dialogues, enabling them to share what was significant to them and to co-produce collective outcomes for their communities. We surfaced what does Spaces of Hope mean to them and contrasted with perceived barriers. Spaces of Hope was referenced both to the emerging relational paradigm underpinning the approach and as a vehicle for capturing subjective perspectives of hopefulness and hopelessness. This drew out key issues that cut across communities, belief bases and policy agendas. For example, of nearly 300 network respondents, 24% understood Spaces of Hope as about personal vulnerability, 22% said about personal connection, social connection, and 19% said personal freedom. Conversely, 39.6% of respondents saw perceptions of or skepticism towards different cultures, beliefs, values, and worldviews as the biggest barrier. And 24.8% of people were weary and lacked confidence that anything might change. This gave us a clear sense of the starting point for changes relating to the community and voluntary sector in that town, and a clear understanding that the somewhat agonistic approach of working through difficult discussions about what we believe in and care about was the right way to go. This was borne out by 90% of people who joined the Spaces of Hope gatherings, noting the experience as helpful, expressing confidence that the Spaces of Hope approach would make a difference over time. And a third of respondents indicated dialogue gatherings catalysed new work and projects by them and their organisations. So the dialogues that they worked in a way that shifted power and identified emerging assets, in the words of some who attended. A bishop said, Spaces of Hope brings together all our different parts and elements into a shared public space to be able to discuss openly and fully with one another, each from our own experience and belief base and worldview, and with our expertise, in order to discover how we best care for one another. So I think the opportunities for Spaces of Hope are almost endless, because they will be necessary and valuable in every community, potentially. A social care consultant said, in terms of crossing lines, I think what Spaces of Hope work has done is it has said that actually we can enter this space on equal terms. A community worker said, Spaces of Hope has these deep roots in kind of engaging intellectually, engaging philosophically, but also wanting to put in simple ways of practicing the things that we care about. The majority of the offers at the minute don't have this open and transparent process. A council official said, in the past, we've had a situation where the policy team has been the policy team and used this kind of council speak, talking in the language of hope or hearts, feelings over the last relatively short period of time has exhibited a shift. And a business leader said, if it catches fire to sufficient extent, we could, through the marketing, create the infrastructure and the assets that actually will allow us to invest with the people in need. I've not seen anyone else genuinely facilitating conversations across assets. They're all coloured by predisposed positions that are all to do with the institutions they're in. Spaces of Hope uses the work narrative, etc., but it's coming at it from a place of, well, let's work out the solution together. So by way of conclusion, in terms of intra-communities dialogue and implications for the role of FBOs and the future of communities in a post-pandemic society. During this presentation, I've summarised the role of FBOs during the pandemic and highlighted the emerging themes from working between FBOs and local authorities. I've introduced my own PhD research and the new paradigm of FBOs that's been produced, responding to Johnson's call for a new understanding to be produced. I've suggested that curating spaces of hope includes drawing together the socio-material nuances of space through intra-communities dialogues and expressing them through a new productive paradigm of FBOs. This curation and brokerage open up the multiplicity of different responses to FBOs in specific contexts, the pandemic, for example, and opens up the opportunity for assets to be consolidated as part of a sustained commitment to a different way of working post-pandemic. A significant role of FBOs then can be to go beyond the community practices that have been so valuable within COVID response and to curate the experiences within communities, offering a voice to the voiceless in a renewed and significant way for social policy. In doing so, these spaces uncover the social material nuances of assets in social policy and offer new ways of supporting long-term policy interventions and partnerships with local authorities. In this way, as we emerge from the pandemic, a new paradigm of FBO and methodology posits a possible threshold moment for engaging in intra-communities dialogue and for the role of FBOs in communities, social policy, and in public life in post-pandemic society in the UK.
And good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today and get to round off this series of really interesting presentations. My name's Evelyn Henderson-Child, and I'm a master's student in intercultural communication at Utrecht University. I'm pretty new to this forum and to dialogue studies as well in general. I'm an applied linguist really by background, so I've been here very much as a learner too, and thank you all for everything today. And the research I want to talk about has grown out of some voluntary work that I've done with an organisation called Utrecht in Dialogue. It began as a project about multilingualism and has turned into something quite different as I've pursued different avenues. I'm partway through, so today I really want to focus on sketching the background of the Dutch context when it comes to dialogue and to start to share some initial findings. So yeah, to zoom into the Netherlands a bit, I think it's a particularly kind of striking context when it comes to dialogue because of its really intentional approach to using this as a tool for community cohesion. Which all really began with the first day of the dialogue in 2002 in the city of Rotterdam, which was a public event open to all, which was kind of founded in response to urban debates that followed the 9/11 attacks that various different stakeholders across the city felt did not contribute to city cohesion. And they saw dialogue as a way to, a more suitable way of building understanding and connection between local people in Rotterdam. The idea was to make dialogue accessible to all, to promote it as a tool for community cohesion, to encourage people to meet others from outside their own kind of social bubbles, to share experiences, listen deeply, hear other perspectives. So lots of the kind of features of dialogue that we've talked about today and that feel familiar, I think. And after the success of that day of the dialogue in 2002, it was taken up by other cities, so not just Rotterdam, but started to spread to other cities and municipalities throughout the Netherlands, and has actually since become the week of the dialogue, which takes place in the first week of November every year, and in some cities all year round. And all of these organisations that are organising these dialogue meetings are kind of united by an annual theme, for one thing. So they usually share, for example, this year it's worthwhile, last year they had belonging, and there's been others such as connection or being seen, but also by a very clear approach and structure to dialogue, which is based in Cooper Ryder's Appreciative inquiry. So this social constructionist approach to organisational change, a form of social action research, which is very much strengths-based rather than problem-focused when it comes to organisational change. And all of these sessions are led by facilitators throughout the Netherlands who are trained. People adhere to rules. So it's a very kind of intentional and structured way to approach these dialogue meetings. And in Utrecht, the first of these took place in 2008. And they're now all year round in both English and in Dutch. They're pretty much at least weekly. Sessions are usually a couple of hours long. They're open to everyone. You can sign up via Utrecht in Dialogue's website. which is interesting thinking about some of what we've talked about today in terms of these public versus private spaces, informal and formal. So they are very much public forums for discussion, but maintain a quite informal character. Utrecht in Dialogue organises trainings for dialogue facilitators in the methods of appreciative inquiry. And Utrecht in Dialogue has its mission as stimulating meaningful conversations between people from Utrecht with different backgrounds about themes that are important to them, and to generate enriching insights and connectedness in the city. They work with partners across the city and nationally in business, nonprofits, local government. And at least prior to the pandemic, dialogues were held in a dedicated space, an office of Utrecht in Dialogue, and also in community centres and hubs that also might have other purposes, such as art centres or other kind of social support systems. And in March 2020, all dialogues moved online to Zoom. And this is kind of really the starting point for my research, because I realized that the practice still remains very much rooted in the city of Utrecht through its partners and the sorts of themes that are treated, that are dealt with in each dialogue session. And so the question I'm really thinking about is, to what extent can the practice of online dialogue be used to foster local place-based community cohesion? So thinking about how the principles of appreciative inquiry might promote community cohesion, to what extent the online community of practice is bound or embedded in the local community, and whether online dialogues explicitly promote online and offline community cohesion. And in terms of kind of conceptualizing place-based dialogue, I'm thinking about dialogue as both method and outcome. So method being very clearly this AI approach. And it's really interesting in the Netherlands that the word dialogue is kind of synonymous with this appreciative dialogue process, which has 4 stages, beginning with introductions, sharing experiences, dreaming, and thinking up actions together. So I'm thinking of it as this process, but also the outcome. So thinking of Boehm's conceptualization of dialogue as a creative practice, what emerges from these meetings, creating connectedness, and where is that in the city, online, or how can we see that? And again, yeah, place too. So I'm thinking of Massey talking about place as a network of social relations, and whether those are rooted in physical location and geography, or interest, or something else, what brings those social relations together. And I've been comparing this to an interesting study of various different cities around the world by Hampton, which looks at the connection between place-based and IT-mediated community, and their kind of recursive relationship that they have in strengthening one another. And the methods that I've taken up is primarily participant observation of dialogue sessions with various different themes, different sizes, can be anything from kind of 6 people up to 50. And I was just reflecting, as Professor Brown was talking about, your kind of position as researcher, and I've had, and whether being an outsider or an insider, I've been working as a volunteer at Utrecht in Dialogue since January, and so I've had quite privileged access to be able to have the sorts of conversations that I might not have otherwise, having built up some of these relationships, but nonetheless, to an extent, disrupting some of the dialogue spaces by announcing that I'm there as researcher. So I'm just reflecting on that for a moment. I'm also doing interviews with key stakeholders, so some coordinators, volunteers, and representatives from other dialogue organisations in the Netherlands. And so, yes, to move on to some of my kind of preliminary findings. So it's been interesting to see how Utrecht in Dialogue, the organisation, has responded. So for the most part, the dialogue format remains the same, rooted in this AI structure. Dialogues are slightly shorter to make it a bit more comfortable in the online space. But otherwise, some of the themes that are discussed have changed, and those have been clearly kind of impacted by COVID. So thinking, there was one recently about creativity and lockdown, or about emerging from lockdown and how different people are experiencing that. There are some formats that have been specially created to allow people to have dialogues in person, so creating one-on-one walking dialogues, the meet and stroll, which allows 2 people to have a dialogue session, again, live and not online anymore. There are still many local dialogues, and this was of particular interest to me, that are really focused on certain city districts. So whilst the people from certain city district gather online, they're very much focused on what's happening in their local area. The partners remain predominantly local from across the city, but at the same time, many participants are joining from other Dutch cities or even overseas. So I have the findings indicate that online dialogue is still used to focus on Utrecht as a place, in that dialogue themes sometimes focus on city districts and bring together certain stakeholders who live in a certain wijk, as they're called, or area of the city. I noticed that people also identify very, very strongly with where they're from in the city of Utrecht. So when people introduce themselves online during these dialogue events, that's one of the first things that people are keen to know, in terms of how they relate to each other, knowing where everyone is from. It's also clear to see that the online dialogue has prompted the creation of some new relationships offline as a result of the online dialogue. Another interesting outcome is to see that the same Zoom link is always used for these online dialogues, and so to an extent this has become a sort of place where people gather. It's fixed. You can always arrive in this room, and so thinking about places, this network of social relations, does this online space become one too? But also that many people are referring to this as temporary and talking about their desire to return to place and return to the community hubs where dialogues always happened before. And so I suppose my question I want to kind of leave this on is, what does this mean for Utrecht as a place, as people are kind of yearning to return to these community hubs, and where does this leave the Zoom room after all of this? So I'll round off there. Thank you very much.